processing center was a series of long, ugly wooden barracks, hastily erected and already surrendering to the relentless damp of a French autumn. The air smelled of wet earth, pine tar, and the faint, acrid scent of disinfectant. It was a smell that clung to everything, a chemical ghost haunting the place. They were marched not to cells, but to a building marked with a red cross. Inside, the air was warm and steamy, a shocking contrast to the chill outside. It was here they met him. Corporal Miller. He was younger than the others, with a shock of sandy hair that fell over his forehead and a face that hadn't yet learned how to hold the hard lines of a veteran. He stood by the door, a rifle slung over his shoulder, but he held it like a tool, not a weapon. His German was clumsy, book-learned, but understandable. "Leave your boots here," he said, pointing to a pile already forming by the door. "And your packs, everything." The women hesitated. Their packs contained the last vestiges of their former lives, a faded photograph, a spare pair of socks, a half-eaten biscuit. To surrender them was to surrender the final link to who they had been. Gisela planted her feet. "We will not." Corporal Miller looked at her, and for the first time, Annalise saw something other than boredom in an American's eyes. It was weariness, a deep, bone-felt exhaustion that seemed too old for his young face. "Ma'am," he said, the honorific sounding absurd in the context. "Please, it's for the delousing. You will get them back later, probably." That probably was a small, sharp stone of cruelty, perhaps unintentional, but it landed with force. Annalise watched the other women. Lenny, a girl of 19 from Dresden, with eyes like a frightened doe, began to cry silently, her shoulders shaking. Ursula, a pragmatic radio operator from Berlin, coolly assessed the situation, unlaced her boots, and placed them on the pile. Her movements were precise, economical. She was already adapting, learning the rules of this new world. Annalise followed Ursula's lead, her fingers fumbling with the wet laces. The act of removing her boots felt like a profound defeat. She placed them on the growing mountain of worn leather and surrendered her pack. Inside was a small volume of Rilke's poetry and a photo of her father in his Great War uniform, his chest freighted with medals. The thought of a stranger's hands touching it, violating that sacred image, sent a hot wave of shame through her. They were herded into the next room, which was filled with steam and the overwhelming smell of carbolic soap. American female medics, broad-shouldered women in crisp white aprons, waited for them. Their faces were impassive, their hands efficient. "Undress," one of them said, her voice firm but not unkind. "Everything. Place the uniforms in the bins." This was the moment of ultimate humiliation they had all dreaded, to be stripped bare before the enemy. Annalise's heart hammered against her ribs. She scanned the room, looking for the leering male guards, the pointing fingers, the mocking laughter. There were none. Corporal Miller stood outside the door, his back turned. The other male guards were nowhere to be seen. The medics worked with a swift clinical detachment, handing out thin towels, directing them toward showers. They didn't look at their bodies with contempt or desire, but with the appraising eyes of professionals looking for lice, for sores, for signs of disease. The hot water was a shock. Annalise couldn't remember the last time she had felt truly clean. The water sluiced the grime and fear from her skin, but it couldn't touch the cold knot of dread in her stomach. As she scrubbed her body with the harsh soap, she saw the other women around her. Gisela stood rigid, her eyes shut tight, enduring the ordeal like a flagellant. Lenny was still crying, her thin body trembling under the spray. Ursula washed herself methodically, her face a blank slate. They were no longer soldiers of the Reich. They were just a collection of pale, underfed women, their bodies marked by the hardships of a failing war. Annalise caught a glimpse of herself in a steamed-over piece of polished metal on the wall, a stranger with hollow cheeks and haunted eyes. The uniform of pride had been stripped away, and what was left was fragile and terribly human. The process was an assault of methodical kindness. After the showers, their hair was dusted with a pungent white delousing powder that made their eyes water. They were examined by a doctor, a brisk, gray-haired woman who checked their throats and listened to their chests with a cold stethoscope. She noted Lenny's persistent cough and made a mark on a chart. She treated them not as enemies, but as patients, as problems to be solved. Annalise felt a growing sense of vertigo, as if the ground beneath her feet was shifting. The world was not behaving as it should. The enemy was supposed to be a monster, a clear and defined evil against which she could measure her own righteousness. But these people, with their clipboards, their soap, and their stethoscopes, were something far more confusing. They were not breaking their bodies. They were breaking their minds, dismantling their certainty piece by piece with every logical, dispassionate, and humane action. Later, huddled in thin blankets, they waited in another room. The silence was absolute. No one spoke. What was there to say? How could they voice the terrifying thought that was taking root in all their minds? What if everything we were told was a lie? Corporal Miller appeared at the doorway. He was carrying a crate. He set it down, and the scent of fresh, hot coffee filled the room. It was a smell from another lifetime, a memory of peaceful Sunday mornings in her family's apartment in Munich. He poured the steaming liquid into tin cups and handed them out. He didn't say a word. When he reached Annalise, his eyes met hers for a fleeting second. There was no pity in them, no triumph, just a simple acknowledgement of a shared, weary humanity. She took the cup. The metal was hot against her cold fingers. She raised it to her lips and drank. The coffee was bitter and strong. It tasted like surrender. And as the warmth spread through her chest, Annalise Brandt felt the first, sharpest thread of her carefully woven identity begin to unravel. The fire was not one of passion or hatred, but of practicality. Through a grimy window, Annalise watched as two soldiers, their faces blank, tossed their uniforms onto a blazing pyre. The gray-green wool of the Wehrmacht, the stark black of the SS insignia, it all curled and blackened, turning to ash in the hungry flames. She watched her identity, her service, her entire world, vanish into a column of foul-smelling smoke that was quickly swallowed by the indifferent gray sky. There was no ceremony, no triumphalism. It was simply a matter of hygiene, the most efficient way to destroy vermin. The act of watching her uniform burn felt more violent than any physical blow. It was an erasure, a declaration that everything she had been was now refuse, fit only for the fire. Beside her, Gisela stared at the flames, her face a mask of cold fury. Her lips moved, silently mouthing what Annalise knew were curses, prayers to a god who had clearly abandoned them. When the last of the uniforms had been consumed, they were led into another barracks, this one filled with long tables piled high with folded clothing. The smell was of starch and clean cotton. It was the smell of America. "Find your size," a female sergeant instructed, her voice crisp. "One set per person. Undergarments, shirt, trousers, jacket, socks, boots. Move." Annalise approached a table, her borrowed blanket clutched around her shoulders. She expected rags, prisoners' stripes, something to mark them, to shame them. Instead, she found stacks of U.S. Army fatigues. The fabric was coarse, olive drab, but it was clean and new. The shirts were soft flannel, the socks were thick wool. And the boots? The boots were sturdy, leather with thick rubber soles, designed to keep out the very mud they had been marinating in. She picked up a pair of trousers, the material stiff and unfamiliar in her hands. To wear this was a violation. It was to wrap herself in the skin of the enemy. It felt like the ultimate treason. Gisela threw the shirt that was handed to her onto the floor. "I will not wear this filth," she spat, her voice trembling with rage. "I would rather freeze." The female sergeant looked at her, then glanced at Major Davis, who had just entered the room, clipboard in hand as always. He observed the scene with his usual dispassionate air. He did not raise his voice. He did not order Gisela to be punished. He simply nodded to the sergeant. "That is her right under the convention," he stated calmly. "She is not required to wear the uniform of her captors if it causes her distress. She may remain in the blanket. Note her refusal in her file. Section C, subsection 4. Non-compliance with standard issue." He made a neat, precise note on his ever-present form. Next. The sheer crushing weight of that administrative response was devastating. Gisela had prepared for a fight, for a heroic stand against a brutal oppressor. She had been ready to be beaten, to be starved, to become a martyr. She was not ready to be accommodated, to have her grand act of defiance reduced to a bureaucratic footnote. She stood there, speechless, as the line moved past her, the other women silently gathering their new clothes. Her rebellion had been nullified. She had not been broken, she had been filed. Annalise took her assigned set. She went to a corner of the room and, with her back to the others, let the blanket fall and began to dress. The flannel shirt was soft against her skin, a shocking, intimate comfort. The trousers were loose but warm. She pulled on the thick wool socks, her feet, numb with cold for days, slowly beginning to tingle back to life. Finally, she sat on a bench and pulled on the American boots. They fit perfectly. She stood up and took a hesitant step. The boots were solid, practical. They grounded her. And in that moment, a profound and terrifying conflict bloomed within her. Her body, so long neglected and abused, reveled in the warmth, the comfort, the simple human dignity of clean clothes and sturdy footwear. But her soul, her mind, her very German essence screamed in protest. Every fiber of her being that had been woven with the threads of duty, honor, and national pride felt the profound shame of this comfort. It was a comfort she had not earned. It was a comfort given to her by the enemy. An enemy that was supposed to be a monster, but was instead behaving with a logic that was both impeccable and insane. They were not fattening them for the slaughter. They were processing them, efficiently, humanely. And in doing so, they were stripping away everything Annalise had used to define herself. She looked around the room. The other women were also dressed in the drab olive green. In the dim light of the barracks, they looked like a phantom platoon of the U.S. Army. Their German faces, their German accents, were now housed in American bodies. The transformation was grotesque. Lenny looked small and lost in the oversized jacket, like a child playing dress-up. Ursula, ever the pragmatist, was already checking the seams of her new trousers, testing their durability. Gisela remained in her corner, wrapped in her thin blanket, shivering, defeated not by a blow, but by a paragraph in a rulebook. Corporal Miller stood by the door, his job to watch over them. His gaze swept the room, and when it fell on Annalise, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of approval. It was not a gesture of friendship. It was, she thought, a gesture of acknowledgement. I see you. You are a person wearing clothes, a simple human gesture. And it was the cruelest thing he could have possibly done, because it forced her to acknowledge the same. She was not a symbol. She was not a soldier. She was just a cold, hungry woman, and her enemies had just given her a warm coat. The cleansing fire had not been in the yard. It was burning now, inside her, consuming the comfortable lies she had lived by, and leaving only the cold, hard ash of a truth she could not yet comprehend. They were assigned to a barracks, a long, hollow room lined with 2 tiers of metal-framed bunks. Each bunk had a thin mattress, a pillow, and 2 coarse wool blankets neatly folded. The precision of it was unnerving. Everything had a place. Everything was accounted for. Annalise chose a top bunk in a corner, seeking a sliver of privacy in this forced, suffocating intimacy. As she spread her blankets, she noticed a stenciled number on the wooden headboard, 482. She was no longer Annalise Brandt, daughter of Oberst Friedrich Brandt, Signals Auxiliary of the German Reich. She was prisoner, 482. It should have felt dehumanizing. It did. But it was a clean, orderly, bureaucratic dehumanization, which was somehow worse than the chaotic, hateful kind she had anticipated. It was an administrative stripping of her name, as efficient as the delousing had been a stripping of her filth. The women settled into a tense, watchful silence. The rigid discipline that had governed their lives had evaporated, replaced by a vacuum of uncertainty. Gisela sat on a lower bunk, still wrapped in her solitary blanket, a silent, fuming statue of defiance. Lenny had crawled into her bed and pulled the covers over her head, her muffled sobs the only sound in the room. Ursula, however, had found a broom and was methodically sweeping the floor, her movements creating a small island of order in the sea of their collective despair. Annalise lay on her back, staring at the raw timber of the ceiling. She tried to conjure the faces of her leaders, the stirring words of the Führer, the righteous anger that had sustained her through years of war. But the images were blurry, the words hollow. They could not compete with the concrete reality of the warm socks on her feet, or the solid mattress beneath her back. Propaganda was an abstraction. A wool blanket was real. An hour later, Corporal Miller entered the barracks. He wasn't carrying a rifle. He was carrying a wooden box. "Mail call," he announced, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. A wave of confusion rippled through the women. Mail? For them? It was impossible. "This is from the Red Cross," Miller explained, his German faltering. "Letters from home. They were held at another camp. They have been forwarded." He began to read out names, not numbers, names. Schmidt, Helga, Bauer, Liesel, Richter, Ursula. Ursula stopped sweeping. Her composure, so unshakable until now, cracked. She walked forward slowly, as if in a dream, and took the thin, crumpled envelope from Miller's hand. She stared at it, her fingers tracing the familiar handwriting of her mother. One by one, women received these ghosts from a lost world. Letters written weeks, even months ago, filled with news of home, of trivialities that now seemed like treasures from a mythical age. The arrival of these letters was a calculated act of cruelty disguised as compassion. It was a reminder of the very homes and families they had been fighting to defend, a world that was now likely in ruins, a world they had failed. Brant, Annalise. Annalise's breath caught in her throat. She slid down from her bunk, her legs unsteady. Miller held out an envelope. It was from her younger brother, Klaus, a 16-year-old cadet in the Home Guard. His youthful scrawl was instantly recognizable. She took it, her hands trembling. "Danke," she whispered, the word feeling alien and traitorous on her tongue. Miller just nodded and moved on. She retreated to her bunk, turning the letter over and over. It was a tangible piece of her life before this. Before the mud, the capture, the olive drab uniform. She broke the seal and unfolded the thin paper. "Dearest Annalise," the letter began. "I hope this finds you in good health and high spirits. Father speaks of you every night. He is so proud of your service to the fatherland. Things are difficult here in Munich, but our will is strong. The Führer assures us the new weapons will turn the tide. We must hold fast. Your victory is our victory." The letter was dated 2 months ago. 2 months. An eternity. Klaus's words were filled with a bright, shining idealism she recognized with a sickening lurch. It was her own. The boy writing this letter believed in the cause, in the final victory, in the honor of her service. He did not know she was now prisoner 482, sleeping in an American bed, wearing an American uniform, her stomach full of American coffee. She felt a hot, searing shame that was more painful than any physical wound. She was a disgrace to the proud name of Brant. Her father, who had won the Iron Cross at Verdun, who had taught her that honor was more valuable than life itself, what would he think of her now? He would see her not as a prisoner of war, but as a collaborator in her own dishonor, accepting the enemy's comfort. The weight of her name, the name she had carried with such pride, was now a crushing burden. The Americans hadn't taken it from her. They had, in their own strange way, given it back to her with this letter, but they had filled it with the poison of her failure. She folded the letter with meticulous care and tucked it inside her new shirt, the crisp paper scratching against her skin. It felt like a shard of glass pressed against her heart. Later that evening, as the light faded outside, another soldier came to the door. 10 minutes to evening meal," he announced gruffly. "Form a line. Food." The thought barely registered. Annalise felt a profound hollowness that no meal could ever fill. But she obeyed. They all did. Even Gisela, after a moment's hesitation, rose from her bunk, her blanket still draped around her like a shroud. Survival was a stubborn, primal instinct that overruled even the most fervent ideology. They shuffled out of the barracks and into the cold, damp air, walking in a loose column toward another long building from which a faint light spilled. The smell that reached them was not the familiar thin scent of turnip soup or stale bread they had known for months. It was the rich, savory aroma of roasting meat. Annalise stopped, the smell so alien, so decadent, it seemed to mock their very existence. The other women faltered too. It was a scent of peace, of home, of a world that no longer existed for them. It was the smell of the enemy's strength and their own destitution. And they were walking toward it, to partake in it, to make it a part of them. The final, most intimate act of surrender. The mess hall was a vast, echoing space that smelled of boiled coffee, disinfectant, and the overwhelmingly rich aroma of roast beef. Long wooden tables and benches were arranged in stark, geometric rows under the glare of bare electric bulbs. The room was loud with the clatter of metal trays and the low murmur of American voices. But as the 20 German women were led inside, a hush fell, Hundreds of male prisoners, German, Italian, were already eating. They looked up from their trays, their faces a mixture of curiosity, pity, and a detached sort of camaraderie. They were all dressed in the same olive-drab fatigues. They were all part of this strange, new, well-fed army of the defeated. Annalise felt their eyes on her, and for the first time, she was acutely aware of herself as a woman in a sea of men. But there was no menace in their stares, only a shared, unspoken understanding of their common fate. They were directed to a serving line, behind which stood American soldiers in white aprons, wielding ladles and tongs with practiced efficiency. Annalise moved forward in a daze, pushed along by the line behind her. She held out the metal tray that had been thrust into her hands. A soldier with a freckled, cheerful face plopped a scoop of mashed potatoes onto her tray. Another added a ladle of green beans. Then she was in front of the main course. A large soldier with arms as thick as tree limbs carved a slice of dark, juicy roast beef and placed it on her plate. It was a thick slice, an impossibly generous portion. He followed it with a piece of white bread and a pat of what looked like real butter. Annalise stared at the tray. It was more food than she had seen in one place in over a year. It was a meal one might eat at a holiday celebration, not in a prisoner of war camp. This was not sustenance. This was a statement, a demonstration of power so overwhelming, so casual. It was more intimidating than a tank. America was a country that could afford to feed its enemies roast beef while her own people were starving on rations of sawdust bread and turnip soup. She carried her tray to an empty table at the far end of the hall. One by one, the other women joined her, their movements slow, their faces stunned. They sat down on the hard wooden benches, placing their trays before them like offerings at a strange altar. No one ate. They just stared at the food. Gisela looked at the slice of beef on her tray with an expression of pure revulsion, as if it were poison. Lenny looked at it, and her eyes filled with tears, her lower lip trembling. She was probably remembering her family in Dresden, wondering if they had even a crust of bread for their supper. Ursula, ever the pragmatist, picked up her fork but paused, her hand hovering over the tray, as if she too were trying to solve the complex equation this meal presented. Annalise sat stiffly, her back straight, her hands in her lap. She remembered the hunger, the gnawing, endless ache in her stomach that had been her constant companion for months. She remembered dreaming of food like this. Now that it was here, she felt no appetite, only a profound and bottomless sense of despair. Lenny let out a small, quiet sob. She shifted on the bench, her face contorted in pain. "Was this loss?" Annalise asked, her voice a dry whisper. "What is it?" Lenny shook her head, tears rolling down her cheeks into her mashed potatoes. "Es tut weh wenn ich sitze," she mumbled. "It hurts when I sit." The simple childish complaint hung in the air. Of course it hurt. They had marched for days. They had been crammed into trucks. They had stood for hours during processing. Their muscles were bruised, their bodies screaming with exhaustion. But as Annalise looked at Lenny's tear-streaked face, and then at the impossible meal before her, the words took on a new, terrible meaning. It hurt to sit. It hurt to sit here, in the enemy's mess hall, at a sturdy wooden table. It hurt to sit on a bench that wasn't coated in mud or splintered from a shell blast. It hurt to sit in a warm, dry uniform while her comrades were dying in the frozen mud of the front. It hurt to sit before a feast while her family starved. The pain was not in her body. It was the crushing, agonizing weight of their collapsed reality. It was the pain of shame, the pain of guilt, the pain of a worldview so completely and utterly shattered that there was nothing left to hold on to. Every principle she had ever held dear, honor, sacrifice, the moral superiority of her people, was being systematically dismantled, not by force, but by a plate of food. The Americans weren't just feeding them. They were showing them that their entire struggle, their immense sacrifice, their years of deprivation, had been for nothing. They were fighting a nation they could not possibly beat, a nation that could waste more on its prisoners than their own government could provide for its soldiers. This meal was the final, incontrovertible proof of their defeat. Not just their military defeat, but their moral and spiritual defeat. Annalise looked up, and her eyes met those of Corporal Miller, who was standing by the far wall observing. He held a cup of coffee. He saw the uneaten food. He saw the tears on Lenny's face. He saw the frozen shock on Annalise's. He must have seen this before. He gave that same small, quiet nod, not of sympathy, but of simple, devastating understanding. And in that moment, the steel armor of Annalise Brandt's pride, the last thing she owned, did not just crack, it disintegrated into dust. Slowly, mechanically, she picked up her fork. Her hand was heavy, as if it were lifting the entire weight of the war. She cut a small piece of the roast beef. She raised it to her lips. She put it in her mouth and began to chew. It was tender, it was savory, and it tasted of nothing but ash. Back in the barracks, the silence was different. Before, it had been a tense, watchful quiet, the silence of caged animals observing a new predator. Now, it was the hollow, echoing silence of a tomb. The meal had been a funeral supper for the women they used to be. They moved like ghosts, preparing for sleep in the dim light. No one spoke of the roast beef. No one spoke of the warm bread. To speak of it would be to give it a reality they could not bear. It was a secret, shameful feast that each of them had to digest alone. Gisela, the hardliner, was the most broken of all. She had eaten her meal, every last bite, with a grim, punishing determination, as if forcing herself to swallow her own humiliation. Now she lay on her bunk, facing the wall, her body rigid. The fire in her was gone, leaving behind only the cold slag of defeat. Her defiance had been predicated on a monstrous enemy. Faced with a bland, bureaucratic, well-fed one, her ideology had simply starved to death. Lenny had cried herself to sleep, her small body curled into a ball, clutching her pillow like a child. Her pain was simpler, more direct. It was the pain of loss, of homesickness, of a simple girl caught in the gears of a history she did not understand. The kindness of her captors had not confused her. It had merely amplified her sorrow by reminding her of the life she had lost. Ursula, the pragmatist, was the only one who seemed to retain a semblance of normalcy. She meticulously folded her new uniform and placed it at the foot of her bed. She washed her face with cold water from a basin. Her actions were a quiet insistence on order and routine in the face of utter chaos. She was a survivor. She would learn the new rules, whatever they were, and she would abide by them. Her shock was buried deep, hidden beneath a necessary wall of practicality. For her, the meal was not a psychological weapon. It was data. It told her who had won the war, and how completely. Annalise lay on her top bunk, the coarse American blanket pulled up to her chin. She stared into the darkness, but all she could see was her father's face, stern and proud in his old portrait. She had been raised on his stories of the Great War, stories of honor in the face of death, of camaraderie, of a clean fight against a worthy foe. He had taught her that one could lose a battle, but never one's honor. What would he say of this? This slow, methodical erosion of the soul? How could she ever explain to him that the most devastating attack she had ever endured involved a clean shirt and a hot meal? How could